Hello, welcome to the Datacolor 2013 webinar series. I'm David Tobie, Global Product Technology Manager for the Datacolor Spider products, and I'm here today with David Saffir, who is going to be teaching you and me a lot about lighting. Now, the lighting we're speaking of specifically here is small lighting, and so that makes it a great webinar to be co-sponsoring with METS, METS being known for their small lights, their hot shoe lights, though they can be used as multiple lights with slaves and so on, but they're best known for that size and type of lighting, and that's exactly the type of lighting we're looking at here as an alternative to what should we call it, big lighting for big spaces, which is a big deal and a big expense and requires a crew or all day to do it. So these are ways of getting those types of effects simply and cleanly without the big equipment. Now we're going to have giveaways from both Datacolor and METS at the end of this webinar, so stick around in order to qualify for those. We're going to have David Saffir explaining about this because I'm the natural light guy, so I might actually learn something from this webinar. So I'm going to let David start in just a moment, but first I'll mention that if you organize things so that the GoToWebinar control panel is visible and you have the questions section open, then I might actually be able to answer some of your questions while David is working. Given that this is not my topic of greatest expertise, I don't guarantee that, but I may transfer a few of those questions verbally to David during the webinar if they come up more than once, and perhaps he can address them as we go along. There's some great shots, some great photos. I am, among other things, an architect, so I very much appreciate the architectural photos that this webinar is based on. I guarantee that while learning by doing is the best thing for this kind of process, that you'll get some great ideas towards the learning by doing that you can do later from the slides, the before and afters, and the good and bad examples that David has picked out for this webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to my partner in crime, David Saffir, who is a photographer, a commercial photographer and printmaker in Southern California, and who's known for his commercial interior photos, some of which you'll see here, and other types, the more industrial stuff, probably won't make it into this webinar, but you should look him up and see some of his other work. David, welcome.
Thank you, David. Again, this is David Saffir. I'm a photographer and printmaker and writer. I live in Southern California, just outside the Los Angeles area. Today I'm in Denver, Colorado. I'm working not from an ideal room. I'm sorry if there's a little bit of an echo from this room. I can't tell, but you may be able to, but there's not much I can do about it. Today we're going to talk about small lighting for big spaces, and the thing that got me started on this was, of course, I get asked to photograph architectural spaces from time to time, and I have a friend named Ted Dayton. In fact, this is one of his images right here, who does this quite a bit for publications and magazines and also for the web, and he's really an expert at this, and I relied heavily on his advice in constructing this webinar. We're going to talk a little bit about what's possible for you to do. I want to caution you that in a one-hour webinar, we're going to try and take a very complex subject and boil it down to its essentials. And there are some elements to the webinar that really need to be taught live. So as we go along, I'll try to point out what those aspects are. I do assume that if you're part of the audience that you have some understanding of how to run a light meter, how to run an on-camera flash unit, and how to work with ambient light and things like that in an interior space. Just the very basics, and we're trying to expand that. And also a little bit about HDR, just a little bit. And so we're going to try and expand on those topics and try and fill in your fund knowledge so that you can go out and get started and learn how to do this yourself. So talking about the scope of work, the first thing I do want to do, though, is talk a little bit about METS, because it's one of my favorite lighting companies. They make really robust portable lighting units for the field, all the way from what we see right here, which I think is the METS 44, which is a mid-sized on-camera or can be slaved flash unit that has autofocus support and some other things, to some new units that have touch screens on the back for the controls, which is very, very convenient, to what we call hammerheads, which is a unit 2 or 3 times the size of this that can really light up a group or a space or a large subject really quite well. And some people put them on light stands with umbrellas, as a matter of fact. So we're going to go forward and talk about some of the options and opportunities, and I want you to, during this session, to think about lighting in new ways. There really aren't any rules. We're really looking to create new images and good images and create new visual environments, which means that you may mix and match tools that we're going to be talking about. That can include ambient light, that can include portable flash units, on-camera flash units, units on light stands, reflectors, HDR, all those tools are in the toolbox. So, the idea in the title, small lights for large spaces, really is referring to that whole toolbox and all the different things that we could use to create the kinds of images that we want and achieve our goals. We are going to be looking at indoor scenarios. I do want to talk a little bit about ambient lighting just as a starting point, because there's a lot of people who do things like real estate photography, and what they used to do was walk into a room, straighten it up, remove a few extras, like a stray teddy bear or an ugly vase, and turn every light on in the room and take a picture and walk out. And those serve the purpose, I assume. People did it for a long time, but it doesn't really create the kind of impact that it doesn't give you the kind of impact that you can get with modern tools and techniques. And people moved on from that to HDR. Of course, originally a lot of people used HDR and as a sledgehammer, and the rooms and the lighting and the colors and textures and everything looked really quite artificial and unnatural. There are ways to use HDR as a supplement to, or in some cases, limited cases, as a replacement for using additional lighting, although it doesn't usually work as well as one would hope. Some people add what's called continuous lighting, which can just be a shop light from Home Depot. That sometimes works, or a different light bulb in the lighting unit, that sort of thing. We're going to talk about basic use of strobes and flash units and how we can mix and match all of those things. Again, we assume that you know the basics of exposure metering and flash unit controls and the basics of HDR processing. I'm not assuming advanced knowledge or anything like that, but just what these things are, how one might use them at a fundamental level. Do remember your color control devices. We've done webinars on the Spider Cube and the Spider Checker. I strongly urge you to go over to the Datacolor website, spider.datacolor.com. Those recorded webinars are available. Those color control devices are very, very useful, and I'll point this out again later on in the webinar. They're very, very useful in helping you get your color under control and manage it to your benefit. So let's move forward. And in fact, here's some of those color management devices here. This is the Spider Checker. This is a Spider Checker with the panels reversed to the gray side, which makes it easy to custom white balance your camera. And this is the Spider Cube. Now, if you just look at these two examples, they're the same room. It's a horrible example of ambient lighting. You've got two terrible light bulbs in the corners. You have different light coming from camera left and camera right, and you can't quite see it, but there's a little Spider Cube just nestled there on the pillows, and once we clicked on the gray area in Photoshop or Lightroom, it did a pretty decent job of neutralizing the color in the photo. So that's one of the things that you can use when you have mixed lighting going. You've got your own lighting that you put in place, you've got ambient lighting, you have light from the windows. How do you color balance all of that? Well, the Spider Cube and the Spider Checker are your friend. One of the things I do want to do is a quick poll. So if you'd help us out and answer these questions, I'm going to take a quick break from speaking, and let's just see what the answers turn out to be. looks like about 2/3 of the people participating today do interior photography. And we have a second and third question. Interesting answer here with flash lighting leading the pack.
Well, that leads to a question David and I often go over. I'm a continuous lighting guy if I use lighting at all, and he's a fan of the strobe because of the small size and the intensity available. So much of the technique he's going to be describing here that's so convenient with these strobes is outside of my area of expertise.
And it looks like almost 60% are using HDR techniques. So that's an interesting mix. That's very useful information. So let's move along a little bit. This is an image that I happen not to like very much. This was one of my first attempts at sort of a run-and-gun approach where I didn't have much time in the house. I took several bracketed frames and tried to work with it in HDR, and it's got a number of issues which I think are really obvious. The first thing that bugs me, of course, is that I forgot to get rid of this blue pillow sticking up out of the couch over here, which will forever annoy me. I did use a fairly long exposure so I could get a little bit of light from the fireplace, but I think I could have done a better job with that. But just overall, this to me has a very strong HDR look, particularly in the texture of the couch material. And there's a lot of unnecessary dark spots, for example, in this corner, in this part of the bookcase. There's some kind of ugly detail from the building next door outside the window. Those are all things that can be addressed. It's easy to go overboard with HDR. Okay, well, what the red X's are for is simply to show you areas of opportunity to fill in with either continuous or flash lighting. There's a lot of dark spots in here. You can't see any detail in the furniture. It's really a beautiful room with beautiful furniture, and we've got very, very uneven lighting. So one of the things that I might do is put a big strobe or flash behind the camera aimed at the wall behind me and have it bounce up and onto the ceiling and fill in all this dark space that way. You might want one in each corner behind the camera. You might want a small strobe right below this piece of furniture here where my cursor is going, over in the right-hand corner. See this deep shadow right here? We want to fill that in. We'd want to fill in over here. So there's a lot of work that one could do with this, and it wouldn't necessarily be addressable via HDR, would it? So that becomes a pretty significant problem. So it's not enough to walk into a room and turn on the ambient lighting and expect to get a good photograph. It's a pleasant image, but even up here in this corner, this shadow to me is next to this light is very distracting. Now, some of the lights that you can use, flexibility matters. Of course, the kinds of lighting units that METS makes are very, very helpful. I realize that not all of us can go out and afford to buy a box full of brand new flash or strobe units, but this particular bag is actually full of a bunch of used ones, and I and Ted Dayton all frequently use these smaller units, less expensive ones, to fill in the less critical areas in the shot. So they would be hidden behind pieces of furniture. I'll go back to this picture. You could hide them behind the bed and have them shine into this corner, for example. And usually on low power, you don't necessarily want to compete with the ambient lighting. You just want to fill in that place. That's where a lot of people make a mistake. They set the thing to full power and blow it away, and now that corner looks way too bright. You can dial down the power on these units. This is a slave unit you can attach to them if they don't happen to have it built in. You can pick up some of these lesser ones at garage sales for your fill lights and your ancillary lights, and rely on the bigger ones like the METs for your main lights and controlling lights and key lights. It's also possible to do light painting. You can buy a reflector at Home Depot and put a couple of bulbs in it, and again, you can, with a longer exposure, do light painting. So you've got a number of options here. One thing that I wanted to mention was that it's very important to have a very, very sturdy tripod that's not going to move if you're going to be taking multiple exposures. And you're going to want to use a remote release or a remote trigger so that you don't move the camera. When you start off with the shot, you're going to do tests in the room. Either you're going to use the meter in the camera, typically set on spot metering, and look into the shadows, into the bright areas, and see how they're working for you once you've got a few lights set up. You can use a handheld light meter, either in incident or spot metering mode. And you can even shoot tethered to a computer so you can really see what's going on in the room as you're shooting. Let's see here, I'm just checking my notes. You do want to check that the windows are not overwhelming the exposure. There's a couple of ways to handle that. This is a great example of a really terrible photograph of a bathroom. I'm going to back up though and say one thing, is that as you add these lights, it's a good idea to add them one at a time and even take intermediate exposures. Take one photo at a time. It may take you an hour to photograph a room when you're setting up the lights, you're trying the light painting, you're trying on camera and off camera flash, all of those things. And you're going to be taking a series of photographs that you may even composite later into one single image. But place one light at a time and bring up the fill of the room and deal with the dynamic range in the room in a way that makes the image pleasing from top to bottom and corner to corner. You have two choices when you're doing this, by the way. You can try and preserve the integrity of the architect's vision, or you can try and enhance the ambiance of a room and really bring things to another level. And I think a lot of Ted's work kind of strikes a balance between those two issues. He's very sensitive. He's very sensitive to the designer's view of how the room should look, but he's also trying to get more out of it, and I think I agree with him. One of the things about windows, I was going to come over here to this bathroom. It is an extremely ugly room that needs several lights in it. Like a lot of bathrooms with the mirror and such, you have to shoot from a corner, and in fact, I've got the door partway closed, which is a adequate solution but not great, and I'm shooting from a dark room behind, so my camera is right where you see my cursor. But one of the ways that you can help diminish the impact of an overly bright window like this one is close the blinds 3/4 or all the way. That's one way to do it. Or you can put what's called some ripstop nylon, which is fabric that you can get at a fabric store. It's the same kind of material tents are made out of. It's nice and white and translucent with light behind it. You can also get neutral density paper at some camera stores, and you can drape it over the outside of the window, and then the window will simply look like a nice, soft, translucent rectangle. But in this room, we really needed to clean up some of the accessories, get some of this junk off the countertop, get a couple of lights back in the corners out of view of the camera. There's a number of things that needed to be done for this image. And this image, again, has got good lighting on the ends, but it's got a lack of lighting in the middle. And one of the ways to handle this is just to put a strobe right behind the camera, aim it up at the ceiling, and put it at a diminished power level, and just fill that in very nicely with a nice, soft, diffused light right in the middle, and fill this area in. And you can see here that the blinds are partly closed. That's a big help as compared to what we saw in the bathroom. The bathroom shot was, I'm ashamed to say it's one of my early ones, but there it is, and that's the way it is. And if you can also use some light painting here, you could also have your assistant stand next to you with one of those shop lights and just paint in a circle on one exposure, nice and broad and moderate intensity, and then go to a second shot and paint a smaller circle inside it. And you could blend those and get a very nice effect. And we'll see how some of those look later on when we look at some of Ted's images. Give me 1 second here. Okay. Now, I forgot to mention something. One of the things that you want to keep an eye on while you're making these photographs and you're using different lights is you place each light in the photograph and you take that new frame. Take a look at the histogram. Look for spikes in the histogram. You may have blown out areas that maybe you're not noticing, or you may have areas of the image that are starting to trend towards being too bright, or too much brighter than the rest of the room. And so you do want to, the histogram is your friend, and you still should be looking at that even though you're compositing images and you're working with moving lights around and that sort of thing. So be attentive to the camera, and don't let control of the overall exposure and the lighting get away from you. Now, this is an image that's really got a problem in it, in that there's dog in it. Now, we all know that taking multiple exposures, or HDR, of any scene that has movement in it is problematic. And of course, David likes to say that huskies have two speeds. They're either running like a bat out of hell, or they're completely still and laying down. But I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. I think that if the dog decides to move, your photograph is going to be problematic at best. But this room is lit largely by ambient light. I think there is some light painting here and here, but I think that overall the effect is a little bit too dark for me. I'd like to see some other lights added. I'd like to see more light in this corner. I'd like to see more light in this corner of the ceiling, generally speaking, as compared to this where the ceiling fan is. And so there's a number of opportunities here. And you could use a number of tools. It's not necessarily a situation where you're locked into, oh, I have to use all strobes, or oh, I have to use all additional ambient lights. One thing that he did do that I think is very important is he probably changed out the bulbs and the table lamps, which really helped. It's important to remember that you do have the freedom to change out light bulbs. A lot of people typically will carry a box full of different types of light bulbs that will fit different types of sockets, and instead of having 100-watt bulbs in here, these are probably 40s or even 25s, just enough to show you the shape of the lamp without blowing out the lampshade. And then you've got the freedom to go ahead and fill in these other areas, and as time goes on and you work with this, the lighting will equilibrate, the room will look really nice.
David, may I interrupt and ask a couple of questions here?
Go right ahead. I'll do my best. I won't guarantee an answer, though.
Well, actually, I pretty much have the answer for one of them already, just not a mechanism to introduce it other than to interrupt you. One is people asking about the difference between strobes and flashes, where basically a strobe is a larger, more powerful unit that's capable of more repetitions. So I don't know if there's anything that needs to be added there, though you're welcome to. The other issue that's being asked about here is quantity of light. How do you determine the amount of flash that you're adding? And I'm not having a script for this webinar. I'm not sure if you get to that later. I wanted to request that you address it at some point.
Let's answer it now. Generally speaking, the smaller flash units have controls on the back, and you can set them to manual mode, and then what one would do would be to dial in the intensity of the flash unit. I have a flash unit, for example, where I can dial it down to a 1/32 the full power, a 1/16, an 1/8, a quarter, half, 3/4 or full power. So you can dial it up and down. The other thing that you can do with many of these flash units, including the METs, is that you can focus them. So they're designed to focus the light to a distance that's matched to the focal length of the lens that you're using. So, for example, if you had a 100mm lens and your subject was, and the appropriate distance from you. You could focus the, actually a lot of flash units will automatically adjust the lens inside the flash unit to match the lens on the camera. You can focus the flash unit to give you a more constrained light. So for example, in this corner you might not want it to be at full diffusion. You can also put grids and diffusers on small flash units. They are now made by several companies. They look like a mini softbox or a mini grid, and so you can have a very contrasty light over here, which you probably wouldn't want, or you could put a diffuser on it and then narrow the beam down a little bit so you have a softer light in a narrower area. Now, I hope that makes sense. You've got a lot of freedom working with these small flash units. You don't just have to throw them down on the floor in a corner where you can't see them and let them do what they want. You can put neutral density gels on them to tone them down if they don't have controls on them, by the way, and that's one way to work around on some of the cheaper, garage sale items that you might pick up for $20.
Yeah, I've mentioned before in webinars, I believe, that the number one thing that I tend to do to people's cameras in public is show them how to put them into aperture priority or manual mode and turn the flash off. The number two thing I'm most commonly doing to assist people with their cameras in public is showing them how to dim the flash, and if not dim it, then how to diffuse it or aim it at something other than the face of the person they're shooting. All of these being techniques aimed in the same general direction.
Yes, and you've really got two choices when you're shooting this sort of thing. Some people use aperture priority, where it's a set aperture and you're trying to control depth of field and let the shutter work automatically. And that can work, but in many cases a manual exposure can be equally useful, and here's the reason, is that you can set the aperture for depth of field and then manipulate the time the shutter is open to get light from the background. So let me back up a little bit here. Don't I go forward or back? Well, I think that image actually was probably a good example. I think that one of the ways you get these lights to show up is to lengthen the exposure time. The amount of ambient light in the room may not change, but the longer the exposure is, the more it's going to pick up light from lesser, the lighting from a diminished light source. And so you could, for example, do a flash to get the corners of the room lit up, and then a longer exposure to let these dimmer lights come up to the point where they're noticeable and they contribute to the overall image. Sometimes people will do what's called dragging the shutter. But in any event, if you're on manual mode versus aperture, the camera's controlling the shutter. And when you're in manual mode, you're responsible for both aspects of your exposure. I also do want to mention that some people crank up the ISO to be able to capture all the ambient light and not have to bother with increase the sensitivity of the sensor and use a slightly longer exposure and not have to bother with supplementary lighting. I have to say I've tried that, and in corners like this you're going to see a lot of noise and both luminance and color noise, and it's going to hurt the integrity of the photograph, particularly if you're going to make a large print or a large version of it. And I'd strongly suggest that you try and work at the native ISO of the camera. In the case of Canon, I think right now that's 100, and in case of Nikon, I think that's 160 or 200, depending on the camera. Well, that will keep the noise at its minimum and help preserve the contrast and color fidelity of the sensor in terms of its performance. Now, this is a photograph that has some supplementary lighting in it and some ambient lighting. It could be improved, but it's a step in the right direction, and it's sort of an example of my evolution as an interior photographer. I don't think I'll ever be, well, not ever, but not anytime soon, be the kind of interior photographer that Ted is, but this is definitely benefiting from his and others' advice. So I had a patio door open here, and there's a diffuser on the other side of the door, so the light is controlled, managed, it spreads out. You've got some nice reflections on this chair, which in this case helps to define the shape of the chair and the shape of the chair leg. Very soft shadows because it's a very broad light source. this pocket right here where the chairs are really needs some kind of light to bring it up at least a little bit, so it's not quite so dark in comparison to this pillar and this lighting top. And now I'm going to zoom in, and you can see that I got some lights going here underneath the cabinet, which really lit up the counters and really provided a lot of nice illumination, but I forgot to put a light underneath the range hood. And turning on the light underneath the range hood, which was an incandescent bulb, was a little bit of a headache because it was the wrong color. And what I really should have done was put a little mini flash underneath here and just pop that either in the same exposure or a subsequent exposure, and gotten that to light up the stove and fill that in. Another thing that you know, there's an eyesore in here that really should have been removed in Photoshop. We really don't need to see air conditioning grills. We know that every house has one in every room, and certainly it didn't need to be seen in this image. So that's one of the things that nowadays I do remove. There is a darker, we've got these nice hi-hats in the ceiling, but we've got a darker area here and on these cabinets, and as compared to this bright area here, it's a little bit uneven, so it goes from light to darker to light to mid-range. And so it would have been a good idea to try and fill in this pocket right here, either with light painting or a broadly diffused flash unit from, you know, with maybe even a grid on it. In some way, try to fill in this area here and equilibrate the brightness and luminance of that photograph. So it's a decent shot. I certainly would never think of giving it an A, but maybe it's a C+ or a B-. It certainly beats the hell out of that bathroom shot I showed you earlier. And it shows you a little bit about my learning process and some of the things that I got right as I went along, and some of the things that I probably could have or should have done better. So we have an image here, and of course you can see immediately left to right. This is before on the left, and after on the right. The air conditioning grid got removed, much to the benefit of the image. I mean, you really begin to see how much of an eyesore that is when you get them out of the photograph. Obviously, the image has been straightened up. It's also been cropped a little bit more effectively. This window doesn't really add anything to the image. Of course, I'm not even sure what's behind it. It's something blue, but getting a crop, it doesn't hurt it at all. In fact, making it more of a vertical sort of echoes this big vertical you get from the painting on the wall and the tall lamp and lampstand and the chair. And of course, we've got just a peek into this back hallway here. So that all works really nicely. You'll also notice the before picture, somebody forgot to move this light, but it's a nice illustration of how we're using a shop light to fill in the chair. See how that's working? So that's working very nicely. There's a couple, I believe there's a couple of lights behind the camera that are just very gently filling in and equilibrating all the luminance right in this side of the room. So we don't have very hard shadows here behind the drapes. The light from the window isn't giving us a really stark, hard shadow. We've got some nice fill in here from this table lamp. My guess is he actually put a slightly brighter lamp light inside this lamp to fill in this part. And then over here in the back hallway, we've got the chandelier going, but that's by no means bright enough to give you the kind of light. And there's definitely a medium to medium high power strobe off camera that's popping and keeping that room going. So it gives some depth to the photograph. Very, very well done image. A little bit less of it over here, by the way. I was pointing at the wrong one with the cursor. A little bit less over here, but it's still working very well. It gives really a nice feeling of depth and intimacy in this image. It's really well done. And of course, here we have before and after images. This image on the left has some great examples of what sort of shows you what needs to be done or what not to do. Just look at this panel here, and you can see that this whole area is too dark. Look up at the ceiling. The ceiling is not even though we've got a light here, it's not doing enough for the ceiling. So we've got issues all across here with a color shift and shadows over here. It's just an unbalanced photograph is what I'd like to call it. This is a great example of how the lighting can sort of get away from you. And if you look over here, it's doing okay. These lights have been set up. You almost might say that it's a work in progress. It's halfway done. And when you come over here to the final product, you can see that we've got better light on the floor, which gives the room a better feeling of space and dimension. We've got better light on the chair. It's a little bit warmer and it's covering the chair better, so you've got some dimensionality in the chair. Nice shadow on the chair front here, which also gives it some nice dimensionality. Good light in this alcove. Great light on the ceiling. I believe that that's probably light painted, although it could also be a strobe with a diffusion or a softbox. You can see one of them here. That's been backed up and maybe added another one to it. The fireplace is really nicely lit, as is the tabletop. I might have wanted to increase the lighting on this chair, but you can argue that having a more brightly lit object in this particular corner would be a distraction for the eye. You know, we all read left to right in this culture, and so the eye is going to move over here, come around to the table, and come back. And I think that if you had a brighter back to this chair, it would stop the eye and stop the feeling of you know, the dynamic feel that the image has in terms of the way the eye moves around. So I think this is also very, very well done. Interesting decor, of course, and very well illustrated by the photographer. Now, this is an image that I like in parts. I like parts of this. Parts of this I think I personally would want to work on just a little bit. But you can see right here that the lighting has been arranged to highlight the edges in the woodwork and really showcase how meticulous the architect was in putting this kitchen together. So you can see that there's lighting from above that's highlighting each of the raised edges, the handles, and other areas. Excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water. And then you've got very nice overhead lighting with just a little bit of shadow in here. I don't think it's too much shadow because the stovetop and all that is lit. You've got good lighting back here in the corner. The window isn't overpowering. And of course, this thing in the foreground in the corner, these materials, the plates and the silverware and the fruit and all that, are not so brightly lit that they distract the eye, but they're brightly lit enough to show you the detail and the TLC that was invested in putting that part of the photograph together. I think the ceiling is a little bit dark here in the foreground, but I think that's a matter of opinion. I think that different people would light that part of the photograph differently. But you get the idea that there's, you know, there is a light behind the end of this counter. There are lights out of sight back here, lighting in here, and so you can't see them, but those lights are very, very useful in terms of giving the room dimension, of feeling of space and warmth and intimacy. You know, one of the tricks, of course, is when you put all these lights all around the room is finding them all after you're finished, isn't it? Now, I'm not sure where this was shot, but this is quite unusual decor. This one was done almost exclusively with ambient light and light painting. I don't think there's any flash or strobe units involved. I think there's a lot of light painting in a big circle down here and the smaller circles sort of coming into the center. So it's not a bullseye effect, but you can see that it tapers off as it comes around here. The curtains are very beautifully lit, very nice feeling of texture and depth to those. A lot of people who make a photograph like this neglect that, and it really flattens out that side of the room. And of course, you've got great textures and things like that on the top and the back of the bed. I think that there's some how do I put this, correct use of HDR techniques in here to bring up the texture in some of these fabrics and in the light in particular. I don't think you could have done this light even with the smaller light bulbs inside it without HDR. These lights in the background probably could have benefited. It might be in a sense of artistic taste that he brought these lights up. To my taste, I'd kind of like to see them match the luminance of the overhead chandelier. Now we're really getting into some unusual decor here. I've never seen chairs like this. I think they're terrific. Definitely, he told me he used HDR on these lights. He wanted to create sort of an ethereal or otherworld effect, and the whole room is kind of like that, isn't it? There's overhead lights that have been placed to illuminate the chairs. There's been some light painting used to illuminate them. And as you can see, the shadows are almost directly underneath the chairs, so it'd be interesting to know exactly how we got somebody up there without getting them in the photograph. The corners have been left to go darker, and in this case I think that makes sense. They're really trying to bring the chairs, the decor and the placement of the chairs and the feeling of intimacy for the two people that might use them into the foreground. You've also got a very nice rug right in front of them, which adds a really nice contrasting texture, and you can see that it's lit from in front or below the camera, and lighting it in that way brings the texture up and gives a really nice contrast to the fabric of the chair. So again, very well done, very, very well thought out image. You know, this is one that I would probably give an A to. I think most people would. And I really like the use of, you know, the dark areas as compared to the light areas on each side. Very well balanced, and great use of symmetry in this case. And we're getting close to the end now. This is an image that that I would have to say, out of the whole series of things we've seen today, is one of my favorites. It almost has a feeling of another time, not just because of, I believe this is a Chinese chest, I could be wrong, but the mix of different elements and artwork, lighting and things like that. He definitely brought these lights under control. One little thing that I would criticize is I'm not crazy about this shadow right here, but again, that's an artistic choice. It's got a really nice use of this overhead light that's built in to sort of highlight this arch as a gateway to another area of the home, which is darker and lit by more natural light. So you've got a lot of really nice transitions here. You've got the cool area, which is more distant, and the more intimate area, which is warmer, has you know, beautiful orchids in the foreground on the sides of the chest. Really nice lighting on the top of the chest and the front to really bring out the detail, and good lighting on the rug, but not so bright that it competes with the chest. So you know, there's a really good, one of the things, the lessons to take away from this is that the balance of lighting in this is just superb. It's one of the best I've ever seen in terms of an interior. You can't, there's nothing to criticize as far as the lighting balance and the use of different elements, architectural elements, and all those things, and even the use of color. I mean, the color, you might call it from a cinematic sense color rating in the background versus, or grading in the foreground. Really a nice comparison of tones, shapes, dimension, perspective, textures, luminance from front to back. It's all there. So if I could leave you with an example of a superbly done interior photograph, this would be it. Now, moving right along, we have a whole series of recorded webinars on color management and photography. We've got planning back. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. We've got things on end-to-end color management and soft proofing, the convergence of still and motion capture, and we're starting to add a lot of material on videography. We have stuff on floral photography and architectural work. It's quite a nice range and a good library. They're available for free at spider.datacolor.com. We have new webinars coming up and more after this. On November 17th, we're going to be planning backcountry photo shoots. I'm going to be going to Zion National Park, which incredibly is open in spite of all the federal things that are going on. So the park is open and we're going, and I'll be using some of that material to illustrate that webinar. And on November 20th, we'll be talking about small scale and macro photography, which I think I mentioned I'm in Denver. I'm teaching a segment on that here tomorrow and Saturday, so we'll be using some of that material for that webinar. So I encourage you to go and look at what we've already done, and to please come back and visit with us again in the future. I'd like to thank Datacolor and Metz for their kind sponsorship of these programs. David, Tobie, and I greatly appreciate that. We do have a Datacolor discount for you. It's 20% off all Spyder products purchased at spider.datacolor.com. It's for the U.S. only, and the code is lighting20. It's valid from the 17th through the 24th. And we have 2 giveaways. The Mets Flash is going to Peter, forgive me if I pronounce this incorrectly, Johansky. And the Spider Checker is going to Joan Wheeler. And our marketing manager, Patty, will be getting in touch with you via email to get the details where to send these prizes to you. Again, my name is David Saffir. I have a blog at davidsaffir.wordpress.com, and my website is at davidsaffir.com. My email is dsaffir@mac.com. I want to encourage you to send me questions. I'm perfectly willing to answer questions from my students. I get a lot of questions, and I'm traveling quite a bit over the next month and a half. So if I miss your question, if you don't get an answer from me in 24 hours, please bug me. Send me in other questions. Send the question again. I'll do my best to answer it in a timely fashion. David Tobie has a great blog, lots of good technical information on it, cdtobie.wordpress.com, and his website is cdtobie.com. Again, on behalf of Datacolor and Mets, I thank you for attending. I hope that you'll come back and visit with us soon. We have lots of great content and material to share with you. Have a great day.